I want to welcome everyone to the second of the IER Presents series, BioArt Talks at CBIS. I'm Kathy High, and along with my colleague, arts professor Branda Miller, I co-programmed the Arts Department series, IER Presents. And these BioArt Talks are also sponsored by RPI's Center for Biotechnology and Interdisciplinary Studies, which is CBIS, the Arts Department, the School for Humanities, Arts and Social Sciences, and finally, the Sanctuary for Independent Media's Nature Lab initiative. I'd like to start today with a land acknowledgement. Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute resides upon the ancestral homelands of the Mohican people, who are indigenous peoples of the lands of New York. Despite tremendous hardships in being forced from their lands, today, their community resides in Wisconsin and is known as the Stockbridge-Muncie community. We honor this community, past and present, and are committed to building a more inclusive and equitable space for all. So these BioArt talks at CBIS are a series of online presentations given by internationally recognized bioartists. Bioartists work with biological materials and use biotechnology to produce their artwork, looking at the materiality of biosystems, such as the body, and the processes used in biotech and scientific research. So I am a bioartist, and this is why I have interest in this area and have invited all these incredible speakers. The artists in these series cover a broad range of topics that include research into the history of gardens, human behavior and future bodies, assisted technologies, non-human interactions, and queer hormone disruptions. The BioArt Talk artists include, last week was Orkan Telhan. We will be recording all of these events and putting them up online on mediasanctuary.org's website. Today, we have special guest and alumni, Heidi Boisvert, who is right here with us. Thank you, Heidi. Upcoming is Aysen Karo Chassin, Anna Lindemann, and Mary Magic. So the funding for this series has been generously supported by the New York State Council on the Arts, and which has been approved by the New York State Legislature and the governor. So we're very grateful for this support. So to go to our esteemed visitor today, I'd like to give you a little background on Dr. Heidi Boisvert's kind of, amazing lineup of talents and things that she's working on. She's an interdisciplinary artist, experienced designer, creative technologist, and academic researcher who interrogates the neurobiological and social cultural effects of media and technology. Boisvert studies the role of the body, the senses, and emotion in human perception and social change. She is currently mapping the world's first media genome while taking great care with its far-reaching ethical implications. So we'll have to ask her about that in the talk. She founded Future Perfect Lab, a creative agency and think tank that works with social justice organizations to design playful, emerging media campaigns to transform the public imagination. She is also co-founder of XTH, a company creating novel modes of expression through biotechnology and the human body. Boisvert is assistant professor of AI and the arts at the University of Florida. She is also senior research fellow at the Norman Lear Center, a research affiliate in the Open Documentary Lab at MIT, and a member of New Inc.'s Creative Science track. So today's talk, Embodied Intelligence and the Future of the Performing Body, Dr. Boisvert will be discussing current empirical research methods and insights emerging from the Limbic Lab, which employs biometric machine learning and predictive models to isolate effective narrative ingredients across various mediums of expression. So please join me in welcoming Heidi Boisvert. Thank you, Dr. Boisvert, alumni. We're so happy to have you here.
Hello, everyone. I just want to first thank Kathy for inviting me to be part of this wonderful series. It's very diverse. And also it's great to be connected virtually again to my alma mater. And I will, since you presented a land acknowledgement, I'll just say that I have recently moved from Brooklyn. So now I am speaking to you from Gainesville, Florida, on the ancestral lands of the Putana and Timucua and Seminole peoples. So I will just share my screen, but Kathy did a great job introducing me, so I'll probably skip the first 2 slides and jump right into it. Let me just share my screen. All right. I'm going to skip these 2 slides because we already talked a little bit about the Future Perfect Lab. But I guess one thing I'll say here is that, oh, can you all see this? Can you see it?
We can
screen? Because I
see
can't
it.
see
It
you
seems
anymore for some reason.
Yeah, it seems a little broken up for some reason. I don't know why.
Okay.
Go to another slide. Let's look at another slide just to check.
Well, I also can't see all of you for some reason.
Pixelized. Maybe it was too small an image.
Yeah, that could be. That's
Maybe
a good
I'm
point.
going to share the screen this way and then go to play. How about that? Is that better? Because I can see all of you now.
Good.
The quality is pretty low.
Yeah, it's still pixelized. Let's go to another slide and just
Okay.
check it. Maybe it's just that one.
Okay. No, I think maybe it's because I selected the optimize for the video. So I'm going to take that off for now and just keep the sound.
Okay. Yes.
How about that? Better.
That looks great.
I think that was
looks much
the issue.
better. Thank you very much.
We had tested the video before. All right, so beginning again. So I guess one of the things I'd just like to express here as we jump in is that also for the past 15 years, part of what Future Perfect has done is dedicate itself to transforming toxic narratives through playful and imaginative experiences. And the goal of that is really to build a more just and pluralist society, one in which everyone not only belongs, but thrives. And I just want to set this up because it will explain the context for some of the work. So in addition, Future Perfect Lab is part of, it's not only myself, we're part of like a large network across the nation of artists and researchers, social justice organizations, experienced designers, showrunners, writers, content producers of all kinds that are really focused on telling pop culture stories that are shaped by narrative archetypes that carry different types of mental models. And the goal is really to incite different types of compelling work to change behavior or behavioral instincts. And in part, what we're really hoping to do kind of long-term is to transform our narrative ocean. So in my own practice, I catalyze this spark by engineering social justice messages for mass appeal through a multi-pronged feedback loop consisting of playful and imaginative creative experiences and empirical media effects and audience research. And this is supported by both co-creation workshops with communities as well as open source tool building. So on the creative side, I co-create inventive multimedia experiences in partnership with social justice organizations and different types of media influencers through multiple touch points using games, VR, AR, transmedia storytelling, interactive web, locative media, dance theater, and more. So I'm going to share a few of those here. This could take the form of an alternate reality game on Facebook to promote human rights, featuring celebs like Victor Garber here, or an animation to raise awareness about unfair immigration laws by teledeporting Spock, or even raising awareness about unfair immigration laws by or even location-based augmented reality apps to change perceptions around homelessness while simultaneously raising funds to move individuals into actual homes. So I just wanted to set the context for the work and why I've departed from this work. However, after making this work for many years, I had a crisis of faith. I began to worry that the very tools that I had been using to positively influence hearts and minds were actually eroding 2 key areas in the brain responsible for empathy and decision-making, the amygdala and the hippocampus. So I first turned to large-scale network dance and performance, embodied intelligence, as an antidote to the intelligent technology that I believe is a slow form of violence, rescripting our nervous systems, and they're literally changing the structure of our brain. I began to bring people into physical spaces and intimate spaces to explore the role the body can play in social change processes by employing dance as a 3D experimental sandbox, and I believe the potential antidote for actually rebuilding that very same gray matter in the brain that was being reduced, that was shrinking because of the technology we're using. So I'm just going to talk over the videos if that's okay. And so Radical Science of Life was the first large-scale interactive multimedia performance I made, and it actually premiered at RPI at MPAC, and it used responsive dance and to externalize the mind's non-hierarchical distribution of thought. The music was generated from the dancer's muscles and blood flow using open source biophysical sensors called the X-Sense, and they captured different types of sound waves from the performer's body. The data from the body was then triggered onto multiple screens, and it was essentially generated through processing, and it was creating these biological algorithms and that were generated from the dancer's movement patterns. In addition, well, you don't see it here, but there were these Microsoft Connects where the audience could, through their own gestures, could create a non-linguistic communication with the performers. But the piece itself conceptually was about, it was an embodied examination of self-organizing systems. And it also was an attempt to kind of reject or maybe rewrite or rescript the legacy of cybernetics, which I believe, today the ethics of cybernetics is still prevalent in, human behavior in terms of shaping human behavior. So next, I wanted to apply what I learned from Radical and the body back to the work in social justice and pop culture, in the pop culture space. So I collaborated on Beware the Dandelions with the Complex Movements, a collective from Detroit. The goal of the immersive project was to teach social justice movement building through complex science. So we used a sci-fi parable and then integrated a data-driven narrative and game-based collaborative problem solving, all communicated through live hip hop and DJ performances. The participant players essentially were controlling a 3D game engine projection mapped onto 24 by 12 foot sentient pod, and the players spatially triggered real-time story content consisting of data visualizations, surveillance cams, systems communication with embedded clues and puzzles. And also I designed these embodied social interactions, essentially little games that were tied to biomimetic principles like mycelium and the murmuration of birds. So we were really looking at kind of emergent behavior. The audience here was tasked with interpreting these different flows of nonlinear information that were distributed through the hip hop lyrics, and then making sense of this narrative in order to kind of collectively transform the framework of the AI system, which was essentially a metaphor for the systems of oppression. However, after working on those two projects, I started to realize that at the root of all the social justice issues that I had been working on was epigenetic trauma, and that our bodies were actually archives of story. Walking Wounded served as both a living lab to work with communities who had been affected in different ways, but also as a multimedia performance about my own experience. So it was a very personal project. And the goal of the piece, or not the goal, but the intention behind the piece was really to transform trauma through movement, sound, and imagery, generated once again from the performer's somatic, but in this time also autonomic nervous system, because we had built a new version of the X-Sense that incorporated other signals. And it sought to give expression to both the unspeakable personal and collective experience of trauma, but also this kind of like the toxic shame that lives at the root, using bioadaptive play. I won't, maybe I'll share a little bit of the piece, but the piece explored this kind of like this interplay between ghost stories and ritual to bring audiences on a cross-cultural journey through the subterranean underground, where they could collectively exercise ghosts, which I saw as signifiers of trauma, using biotechnology to redefine the performance and narrative architecture. As a workshop, the piece also sought to restore nonverbal interpersonal connection in a safe environment and to help foster resilient communities and bring movement back into movement building through we used an embodied co-design process using multimodal movement prompts. And this would culminate in a very kind of intimate experience where we would create these nonlinear micro performances with a shared vocabulary. I'll share a little bit. This is really just an exploration here of the tools. So the idea here was that we used the biophysical and motion data stemming from the XSense, and it was sent over Open Sound Protocol and then mapped essentially to this real-time live drawing application in open frameworks. And then the musical and spatial parameters were then mapped to max MSP. And what we did with the sound data is that we enabled the performers essentially to co-create live drawings with their unique gesture vocab, but also generate music based on solfeggio frequencies, which essentially quiet the parasympathetic nervous system. So, and the idea was to use the gesture vocabulary that stemmed from the workshops to create a library of generative shaders and brushes that could create these live drawings. So anyways, that's that piece. I'm still working on that project, also running workshops with different communities. And so I think part of what emerged there is that initially I thought I would develop the work in collaboration with these communities and then work with professional dancers to create a commissioned work, right, to perform publicly. But I realized in the process of working with communities with the tools, using the XSense to generate the music and the imagery, the drawings, that it was really, it felt extractive. So I wanted to actually restore, to maintain the intimacy of the group and keep those performances inside the groups. Cool. Oh, so in November, just recently, I premiered a new work at New York Live Arts called Lizardly. Lizardly is a live mixed reality play, which I co-created with Kat Mustatia, that explores AI, environmental collapse, and interspeciality. And the story basically follows Vincent and Rebecca, whose marriage is falling apart as they brace for an oncoming hurricane, while simultaneously turning into lizards. It's set in a post-Anthropocene Miami, and humans have not been wiped out, but they've just kind of had to adapt to this rapidly changing rapidly changing environmental shifts by mutating. So basically, they're kind of stuck together during the storm, and they're inside their smart home. So we think of the smart home ended up becoming like a third character named June, whose functions and malfunctions essentially are being like weaponized in this escalating domestic turf war. So I'll share a little bit of that with you. This is June over here. And June basically is the cinematographic point of view as well. So June is wearing a VR headset, and she's also wearing these Mimu gloves that are triggering the animations you'll soon see in the environment, as well as the audio and the lighting and things of that nature. So the staging interface is essentially the VR, along with real-time motion capture data from the performers and machine learning to create a vivid portrayal of hybrid humans in a post-human world. As a way of bringing this metaphor of transformation outward, June, who's right there on the left, is the kind of like an antiquated and repurposed smart home. And she influences the characters' surroundings through their gestures and triggers the transformations in the environment, such as lights, sounds, animations, and the creatures, as I said. So maybe I'll just skip ahead here a little because I don't know if the characters have entered yet. So that's, the little dragonfly there. I'm just going to skip ahead so you can see the mocap lizards. Here they come. All right, and we had to calibrate. So working with mocap suits in the city, there's lots of drift. So every time you have all this magnetism under the earth, you have to essentially recalibrate the suits. So essentially, this is live mocap data that's being remapped or retargeted to these lizard bodies here. And everything was built inside Unity, the game engine. So cool. So I'm going to move on. I am currently collaborating right now on Theater of the Mind, which is an immersive journey inside a 15,000 square foot installation, exploring how our minds see and create the world around us as participants traverse this unique environment and try a series of sensory experiments. The production is co-created with David Byrne and Mala Guankar, and it's based on a series of neuroscience experiments. So David and Mala traveled around the country or around the world for about a year, visiting different neuroscience labs. And we've tried out a bunch of different like light and sound experiments, but we've decided upon a certain number of them that work most effectively for the most amount of people. So essentially, the story is told, so it's all these experiments, but there's also a layer of story that's told retrogressively, like a Gertrude Stein novel, which is based loosely on David's life and growing up. So this is one of the experiments, and it's based on a study called Being Barbie, where you experience being inside a child-sized body. And in this case, we're actually going to have a David doll, which that's a little bit of a spoiler alert, using 2 4K video cameras patched into Unity and then networked to 16 VR stations. So you're essentially traveling through the experience with 16 people at a time. It's a massive feat. We have like many rooms happening simultaneously. So, so I guess in terms of what I'm responsible for, I'm developing all the technology essentially that supports the show, including the live stream VR. I ensure that the sets, lights, sounds, and all the physical objects demonstrating scientific effects actually work. So for instance, in this rhodopsin experiment, we're essentially blasting photolights at a specific time frame to generate these ghostly after images in the participants' retina. So essentially they're seeing what's not actually there. And in addition, I built out this custom show control system using Medialon and Python to trigger environmental cues and architected the, like the network architecture. So just if you're interested in going to Denver, it's premiering on September 13th. And I would love to have been able to also had a video to walk you through the show, but I can't do that for NDA purposes. So quickly, I'm just gonna, since I kind of shared like my 4-part methodology, I'm gonna quickly run through the CoDesign methodology, and then I'm gonna jump into the science and how it relates and tie it all together. So with each project that I work on, I typically kick them off with something called a multimodal co-creation workshop, which I've termed play as process. And we're actually designing some cards right now so that organizations and communities can do their own co-creation workshops. And what I do here is I bring together like a meshwork of influencers around a given issue or theme. And then I take them through this 4-part process where we move from subject matter experts, typically, so if we're talking about homelessness, we might bring together individuals from, formerly homeless individuals, religious leaders, lawyers, police officers, even, advocates working on that issue together to co-design the work. And we use this process to bring them through rational and then emotional problem solving towards complex system and then embodied design. So I'm also using movement and embodiment in this process. And then eventually what we're doing is we're kind of rapid prototyping to enable, essentially it enables me to more closely map the social issues to story design and interactive mechanics, which allow us to increase authentic engagement, behavior change, and learning outcome. So, and one of the things that I think is important, when you're doing these rapid prototypes is actually having public events where you can, invite individuals who are working in those fields to experience the work. And it also allows for potential cross-sector strategic partnerships to give, feedback and potentially, come on to garner more monetary support or also outreach and dissemination support. So, and this is just an example. This is, I won't go into detail, but it was a wonderful experience going to Turkey and working on gender equity and women's empowerment. But we had these 4 cool projects, and this is Halame. And the idea was to create this hologrammatic figure. We used motion capture data, then we retargeted it again to this Halame character. And then we also had voice recognition. There's a microphone on the other side. So you could give Halame certain prompts to do, but the idea was really to raise awareness around gender equity in the home for this particular project. We also had projects that looked at domestic violence and those sorts of things, but this group really wanted to take this is only a small prototype size, and they're going to scale it to like a pop-up in a public space on one of the busy streets in Istanbul. So that was kind of the idea of that piece. So now I really want to jump into the research, and so you kind of see how it informs the creative process. I felt it was better to show the work as opposed to start with research, because sometimes it's very abstract. So on the research side, part of what I do is I conduct media effects and audience research using survey, story coding instruments, coupled with biometric and linguistic analysis to inform the narrative design, the story creation, the distribution, and audience engagement plans. So central to this research is the Limbic Lab, which is a biometric lab and AI system that isolates the narrative ingredients that move us to act. The Limbic Lab consists of these 2 components here, the narrative engine and the media machine. The narrative engine, which you're seeing here, takes in and syncs real-time data from brain waves, biophysical data like heart rate, blood flow, body temperature, muscle contraction, as well as eye tracking and facial recognition, while a subject is viewing or interacting, if it's a game, interacting with the media content or a website. The data is captured at key places in the time code where these critical plot points occur. So I'm using story coding, right? I basically deconstruct the narratives and identify these kind of salient narrative nodes that I then, when I'm capturing the data, I'm only taking that essential data that's meaningful at those key points, which I'll show you in a minute what it looks like on the back end. And then we're really looking for, critical plot points, character interaction, or different types of unusual camera angles that occur based on this story coding. I also am taking in this kind of survey data, which is looking at ideological preferences and viewing patterns. We also gather psychographic and demographic profiles, and then we integrate this, into this massive system to gain a deeper understanding of the individual. So we're getting in, different types of both static and dynamic data. So the media machine, which is another piece, which is not fully built out yet, basically then we use predictive models in machine learning to automate. So we're not at the automation level, but I can explain kind of like where we are at the process if you want to talk about it more later. So, but the media machine, we do have the predictive models and machine learning models to kind of like isolate these narrative ingredients, but we haven't gotten to the point of automating that, bioadapting that content. So this is just a look at kind of like the back end, the database, a sample of, one of the studies that we did with episodic television. And essentially, like the more media imprints that I get into the database across different types of genres, whether we're talking about films or games or webisodes, we've built out some new story coding also for podcasts and explainer videos and things like that. The more data we essentially get in, it's easier to kind of like automate these. It's easier to build like more nuanced predictive models, right? So it'll be more accurate. So I guess a side note I'm going to mention is that obviously during COVID, it was really hard to do in-person research, having participants and subjects come in. So essentially I had to pivot from like, towards remote studies, which, only allowed me to capture facial expression and eye tracking, but using a webcam. And then what we could do is we can interpret that data instead through post-processing. And then these are just some of the annotations I wanted to show you how I'm structured, how the story coding relates. So here you see this is just mostly the affectiva data. So it's capturing the facial expression. And then on the left-hand side up here, is the eye tracking, by Stephen Hawkins. This is capturing eye tracking. And then what I've done here is I've started to build in these annotations based on the story coding in terms of like the narrative arc and the plot development. And so all of this basically gets exported right into this massive database as these various types of nodes. So then I can run correlations between all of these different variables. Hopefully that made some degree of sense. So I guess what I'll say is the goal of the research, in case you were getting like, frightened by it, is really to find out what combination of narrative ingredients are the most appealing and galvanizing to specific intended audiences to enable, us, when we're making creative projects, but also by extension, the field, the social justice field, to create more effective media. So, part of my concern, I'm not going to talk about it right here, but we can maybe in the conversation discuss the ethical concerns of creating open source technology that then, can be appropriated for purposes that it's not intended for. So, I'm really invested in the social justice space and on, very important critical 21st century issues, but, doesn't mean DARPA and other crazy people couldn't take this and repurpose it, or marketing companies. And so I'm trying to figure out right now, is there another open source licensing model that we could write that would allow people to use it based on use value? So yeah, so I guess, this is one of the studies that emerged from the episodic TV research that I participated with the Norman Lear Center. So, the research is also turned into white papers and things like that. So now I just want to talk a little bit about the open source biophysical tools, the various types of tools that we use. So part of the reason why, I believe in open source community is that I want to make not only the research instruments, even the story coding instruments and the methodologies and the scientific protocols open source, but also the different types of, hardware and software that we build to do the research for the culture change field, right? Or independent media makers that could benefit, or artists that could benefit from it. So this includes, the open source biophysical sensors for measurement and creative expression, like the XSense, which I actually also use in my lab now as well, not just for creative expression. And this was co-created with Marco Donnarumma, who actually invented the first one, but then we built this wireless version, multiple versions together. And now it reads both your autonomic and somatic nervous system, along with the different types of, software for feature extraction for that work. I think just for the sake of time, I won't go into, I don't know if it's worth going into detail how it works. I guess quickly, I just talk over this. So, basically there's a MMG sensor in here, mechanical muscle sensor, and it's, a tiny little microphone, and it's able to capture your muscle contraction release. We've also added an IMU sensor to read accelerometer, gyroscope, magnetometer. There's also a temperature sensor and a host of things. So we have lots of streams of data coming in, and then all of that data is sent wirelessly to any third-party applications, over OSC or any other network protocol. So yeah, so that's that. The other thing that we've been trying to figure out the best way to release are some custom Python scripts that we've been building out for the Limbic Lab. So which essentially is like the machine learning small Python scripts, but we've also built out this new linguistic analysis tool. So here, what you see is we're able to gather sentiment analysis. So in the survey instrument, we're gathering data about 37 different issue areas. So the idea is, how can we map all the other tools to capture, the same fields of information? So here we're able to capture, you can automate, you can ingest a script of any kind in here, like a film script, whatever you want to ingest, and it's going to parse and deconstruct all of that data. And then this also, the deconstruction, which basically becomes a CSV file, is also imported into that database, right, for correlation mapping. But all of these, we are housed on GitHub. And part of what we're trying to do now, which I'll get into, and this looks very ugly, but this is just to help me understand where we're going, is I want to be able to make all of the data, but not the raw data, accessible to others like journalists, media makers, social justice organizations, academics, so they can run their own correlation mapping between the variables and then generate real-time data visualization. So right now we're exploring using Plotly, but it's not very robust, and we really need a custom visualization solution. But the idea here is to be able to render the database of media imprints that you saw before accessible on a front end. And so that people could basically pick different types of filters here and then run their own, queries and studies. So we're in the process of working on that right now. It's very early stages. Cool. So I guess in addition to tools for research and analysis, I also like to build custom instruments for, dance and theater pieces. So this project here is called the 9 Gems system, which I worked on with, well, Kevin worked on the dance piece, the Walking Wounded piece with me, which is why we developed this. And he's a sound designer. And basically we created this kind of custom max patch based on the 9 gen systems, which looks at these emotional bodies, right? So, and then we map these emotions to solfeggio frequencies within max, if that makes sense. So yeah, and then I'm almost there. And I other things, build out. So, for the Lizardly project during the R&D phase, we also created this kind of like gesture database using InteractML, and I've been wanting to build a gesture database for the trauma work, because part of what I discovered working with individuals that have extreme forms of trauma is that they have very limited gesture vocabulary. Maybe I can even play this video. Oh, hold on a sec. They have very limited gesture vocabulary. And so the idea was how can we expand the gesture vocabulary through kind of play, right? Through music and imagery and that thing. So part of the development for Lizardly, we ended up having to build this database for the Mimu gloves so that we could patch them into Unity. And we discovered this InteractML tool, which was developed by Phoenix Perry, who's another game designer, very cool person. And so we had to basically train the system to trigger these different like animations. And so now I'm in the process of like using what we discovered and applying it to this other context. Cool. So I guess one of the things I want to say is that, they're using this kind of like 4-part process, right, which is very interdisciplinary for many years, and it's been like fine-tuned. We've been able to increase awareness and of different types of hot button issues and change attitudes and behaviors in a large number of countries. But essentially, like none of this work would be possible without using emerging technology and cultural expression, right, to reach people where they're at. So, and I just wanted to acknowledge that each of these projects requires an interdisciplinary team of artists, scientists, engineers, programmers, experienced designers, storytellers. So it's not just all me. I work in collaboration on each of the projects. And also the neurobiological research that informs the design and narrative decisions also bring together various fields like social scientists, data scientists, database engineers, story coders, programmers, and all sorts of people. So there's a lot of architecture, I guess, behind this work that I just want to acknowledge, and a lot of labor and care. So I guess in closing, well, the creative work has been in fact impactful. I'm now wondering, how can we make neuroscience research and research in general more accessible, right? More pop. So in addition to like building out the front end for the media genome, I've been collaborating with veteran New York Times journalist Julie Skelfel on a podcast series called Get Media Savvy. And the goal really is to kind of equip people, like everyday people, with media literacy skills without, using the word media literacy because it puts people to sleep. So to take back their, hijacked cognitive and affective faculties. So we're in the process of scripting that and, chatting with PBS to see if maybe there's other ways to make it more like Schoolhouse Rock videos or something that's a little bit more pop and for the right age bracket. So I don't know if I'm out of time, but I guess if maybe in closing, if that's okay, Kathy, I just wanted to share something because I think, I don't know, I did this wonderful collaboration for the Science and Theater Festival with I was invited, so they paired a scientist. Well, I see myself as a quasi-scientist, more of like a researcher, but they paired people working on different types of research with playwrights. And what emerged from that process was this piece called Affinity, which is inspired by the research in the Limbic Lab, actually, and it's a social critique of it. So I thought it would be a nice way to kind of, listen to it and kind of kick off a discussion around the ethics and all of those pieces. So if we have time, it's about just a 2 minutes I selected. Cool.
Definitely.
And let me know if you can hear it.
What are you doing?
We can hear it.
I wanted to see what you were seeing.
We're seeing the same thing.
No, we're not. Back at 10? That dog in your frame? That dog's not in mine.
Weird.
You don't think that that's weird?
I said weird.
But like, it doesn't matter.
Does it matter? I like dogs. I'm sure that's why there's a dog in mine. You are not really an animal person. And the scene is supposed to elicit positive sensations.
Doesn't that make you feel manipulated?
Yeah, but I mean, it's fiction. It's media. Of course, it's trying to manipulate me. What is it there for if not to take me on a journey and make me feel things? Hey, babe. What's wrong? You want to watch mine, you can. I just think you'll like it slightly less.
I talked to my dad today. Did you know that in his version of Atlantic Avenue, Conroy is a man?
That cop show?
It's not a... Okay, I'm not sure. Yeah, you're dating.
I was just trying to make sure I
Well,
had the right show in mind.
I'm just a little touchy today. Can you not make comments?
Fine, okay.
Okay, so I told you about Conroy. Sam Conroy, Samantha, dating Felicity
Yeah,
Jonas,
sure.
the sex
I
worker.
remember.
Okay, so in my dad's version, Conroy dating Felicity, the sex worker, is a guy.
I mean, that makes sense that she would be a woman in your version.
Well, so you think the default's a guy?
Well, I mean, Meta, you're a lesbian.
Thanks.
I'm sorry, I'm not trying to make jokes. I don't think I'm understanding.
Atlantic Avenue is a wildflower show. Wildflower's mission is representation, right? Their whole thing is... Okay, so you and me were watching Lady Liberty, right? They throw a dog in your scene, give you warm fuzzies, whatever. It's just like pure entertainment. But my dad doesn't know it. But I specifically recommended that we watch a wildflower show together because Wildflower uses its variables to influence people's perception of identity. Right? They make a cop show that my dad would like, but they make the central character the rogue cop. They make her the gay woman.
So why is he a dude in your dad's version?
Because they only push so far. It's all based on research. Someone's walking the line, a little uncomfortable with gay people. They'll nudge them with like a well-placed, likable, or complex gay character. They wouldn't shove a lesbian in a rampant homophobe's face. That would just stop them from watching altogether.
Okay, I think that's all. Thank you. If there are any questions, maybe I'll exit my screen here.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that incredibly rich presentation, Heidi. That was really mind-blowing. Really, really great. You're doing so much and it's so inspiring. Yeah, everybody, please either unmute yourselves and ask your question yourself, or and I can call on you if you want to put your hand up, but also if I miss you, put it in the chat. I'm happy to take any questions for Heidi. We had one that came in earlier that was relating back. So we're going back in your talk earlier when you were saying about how video is different from the technology that is shrinking the brain. And the shrinking the brain is something that you said. So if you can think back to that and maybe address what you were talking about at that point, that would be great.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's interesting because actually, this was the subject of my dissertation at RPI, right? It was really to look at the social, cultural, and neurobiological effects of intelligent technology. And at the time, I was really, I mean, this is back in, I don't know, 2013, 2014, when I started. And it was, I think there's more of an awareness now, right? That social media and there are all of these harms that's coming to play. But at the time, nobody was talking about that, or they didn't want to be the gadfly, criticizing big tech companies, I guess. But I think part of what I was looking at there was, I was predominantly focused on mobile devices, web, not necessarily the content so much, but actually the technology itself. And it was really hard to find, there was scant research on the effects of these technologies. And so the idea for me was really to figure out, like, how can I use my own artistic practice as a way to mitigate, right, intervene into that. And so part of what surfaced from the research as I started to cull it together was that there are particular regions of the brain that were affected, the amygdala and the hippocampus, and they're responsible for two key things, one of which is emotion regulation and activation, right? And the second is the production of knowledge schemas, right? Our ability to parse and make sense, make meaning in the world. And I was deeply concerned about that as somebody that, was using these technologies essentially to cultivate empathy. But then in the end, I was using technologies that were eroding those same parts of the brain that were responsible for empathy. And so I wanted to kind of dig in and figure out, well, what is an alternative? What is an antidote to that? And so then I started to do research and also had a very, a personal experience, which I won't get into, that made me very conscious of the role of stress and maybe like techno stress and other kinds of stress on the body and the various types of systems that are interrelated that cause, emotional distress. And so I was anticipating or seeing this as a potential breakdown of social fabric. And so I wanted to think about, well, what I did for myself to bring myself to a place that was healthy and balanced again was actually to start to dance again. So I started moving and dancing. So I started to research on somatics and the body and, like, the body's intelligence. And most of the studies kind of supported or reinforced what my assumptions were, which that the same particular regions of the brain that were being affected, right, by technology were actually growing, right? They were responsible for, breath, alignment, very simple things we can do every day, and moving the body. We're actually healing that part of the brain, if that makes sense. Yeah, I hope that addressed the question.
Yeah. No, that's great. And actually, just a follow-up question about that, because maybe people understand this term epigenetic trauma, but maybe if you could just, I know there's been an awful lot of attention to this in the past number of years, and I think it's really an incredible field. So if you could just kind of give us a layman's definition of what this is and how, what sort of some of the state of the research in general has been about around that.
Yeah, it's funny. A lot of the research really focuses on World War II and individuals who were in concentration camps and who's, the next generation. So epigenetic is really, that a trauma can carry right through your genes from one generation to the other generation, and it can be discerned through empirical research. And so I guess part of what is interesting is that most of the research really focused on the way that, different from generation to generation, and it was really more looking at the biology in terms of the body's health based on being, fasting or being starved or not having the proper nutrients, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. And so, so they looked at how those physiological patterns, those biological patterns were actually disrupted from one generation to the other, looking at particular cell behavior. And so I think this research has been like expanded, right, to other types of social psychological scenarios to see, if you look at chronic stress behavior, in communities of color, due to whether it's, poverty, violence, a whole host of things, can you see patterns of behavior across generations? And so I think that's really where the field has kind of like expanded out. And I think so that's the part that, I picked up on, and to try to understand, where in your body, somatically does trauma live? and it's not necessarily where it started out, right, in a particular
Right.
physical space.
Right.
So yeah, so I think that's kind of where we're at. And so I started to just do research around just, trauma-informed care and other practices like that.
Thank you. That was really very grounding. So I appreciate that. People jump in if you want to ask something or put it in the chat. I'm just going to keep going if I don't hear from you also, because I have lots of questions for Heidi. One of them is to go back to, I think it was in the Limbic Lab you were talking about, you kind of skipped over describing the actual process of the media machine when it's collecting all this data. Like, how does it coalesce and this sort of bioadaptive information? And I mean, I'm just imagining the amount of information coming in and just how to sort of think through how you deal with that. It would be really fascinating to hear a little bit of an outline of that.
Yeah. Yeah. So I guess where we're at right now is we're basically we're gathering a lot of studies, case studies, let's just across different genres of expression, and we've expanded. So we started with episodic television as a way to build the pipeline, like to sort of understand what pieces fit together that feed into the database, and then how to externalize, how to transfer that data and parse that data. And so what we've done now is we've been gathering other case studies across different genres so that we can, build the repository inside the database. And so the way that really works, if you saw the image with all of the little clusters there, really what we're doing is like cluster analysis. And so right now we're getting in, the biophysical data, all of those different things I mentioned. We're getting in the survey data with, psychographic, demographic, ideological, issues, all of those things into the database. We're putting in the linguistic analysis. So I'm basically taking all the scripts from those various shows and the content pieces, having that deconstruct some key things around sentiment, right, around issue area, around even just, are there male and female characters, what type of protagonists and things like that. So we have these different fields of variables. Those are all going inside this massive database that I'm calling like the media genome, and they're different genres. And so the way the studies work is typically, you'll do the survey analysis, and then that link kind of carries you to view the content, right? And then you'll get another survey that's more specific to the content type we've seen. So that's all going in the database. Then what happens is from there, we basically built a machine learning algorithm in Python that is essentially based on a neural network. And then that neural net is essentially parsing, right, all of the data types and starting to isolate the ones around specific affinities. So what the database is doing is just basically built in Neo4j, which is, an open source JavaScript database. And that's just, can you still hear me? Because my headphones gave me this.
Yeah.
No. Okay.
Yeah.
Great. And so the database basically is holding all of that content. And then on the front end, the idea is to be able to, you can just run. So the reason why I want to build the front end is because it reads Cypher, right? Which nobody's going to learn Cypher to use it. It's not useful. But what the Cypher is doing is you can run queries, put queries together, correlations between the different data types. And so once you've done that, you've isolated a data set that then can, and then from that filter, the goal is to be able to use those smaller ingredients that have been parsed to then automate the production process based on a library of imagery, right, or clips. So that in part is, I'm interested in doing that also as a form of social critique, because most of the content's becomes pretty boring. Yeah.
That sounds really incredible. It somehow it was making me think back to one of these projects by the McCoys, where they were looking at different TV shows and parsing out different scenes, but according to random selections like plaid. It's a very different system than I think what you're setting up. But I love it, and it makes me also think about this question about narrative, because you're really dealing with narratives over time in a way. And I'm just wondering, because I feel like narratives begin to change in response to certain situations in front of us, like the pandemic or whatever, Black Lives Matter, these issues that come up culturally that are quite in our face, and really needing to be paid attention to, begin to reshape some of the way our cultural narrative responses occur. Shaped.
You mean because of the context? The context, the social political moment changes, so the context of those stories change.
Yeah, precisely. So, I mean, how does that get dealt with? Because I can imagine you're kind of picking from a long period of time to grab narratives, or maybe not, but just how do you think that part of it through?
Yeah, so it's interesting. So, with the Norman Lear study, I'll say, one thing that we did is we actually used survey data from both 10 years ago that they had used. We had baseline data from 10 years ago in terms of like people's ideological preferences and viewing patterns. And then we used like the new data from 10 years later. And so there's that piece, where we can have, that part of the process, I guess, like updated, right? But we would have to give the same content types. The second piece is that another thing during COVID that Natalia, she's one of my collaborators, she was working on an open source, like an API scraping tool from different types of socials. So part of the problem with a lot of those tools is that they don't have a lot of historicity, which is the point that you're raising, right? So we can grab that data, but we have to grab that data to a certain kind of like date and time. So really the way that tool is useful is like in the moment. So, how I'm now that we've been using the tool, not just for shows that are popular, we've been using them with grantees, right, that are working on new content, like Define American and like
great.
Break the Room, who are working on content around like social political issues like immigration, trans rights, and things like that. The idea is to be able to use that as like a temporal, like a temperature gauge, for that moment when the social conversation is happening. But I think the great question you raise is really an interesting design challenge. Like, how can we get sort of the historicity over time in terms of how people's attitudes change using these tools? And, I don't know exactly, in terms of like how to address it, because in terms of you really need baseline and end lines. You need to be able to work with the same community of people over many years, and it's very hard to get funding for that. So anyways, just raising those things, but it's an interesting conundrum.
Yeah, thank you. No, I appreciate that context. We might have time for another question or two. Anybody want to jump in here? Is that Matthew? Yay. Hi, Matthew Gant. All right. Nice to see you.
Yeah, too. Thank you so much for this talk. It's really, really beautiful, really inspiring. Sorry, I was kind of flickering on and off because I'm trying to figure out how to sort of formulate this question in kind of a succinct way. But I guess maybe the short form, I just want to hear you talk kind of thoughts on sort of spectacle when working with technology and specialization in terms of the teams that go into making it. Because I think one of the things that's really tough that probably we all deal with is, when we do tell a narrative through neural network creation or sort of a Python script that interfaces with the game engine inside of surrounds, it requires these teams, right? And teams require funding, require context. So I feel like it's always this kind of question of navigating, what stories get told, how do we function inside these larger contexts. I know, sorry, that's like hideously general, but I'd just love to hear about your own experience with that.
Okay. I guess, can I just repeat back the question I think I heard? So
Sure.
I loved everything that you just shared and how you formulate it. I think that the question is more around like, how do we deal with this kind of tension between the spectacle, right, of the tools?
I think so. I think there's sort of twofold. One is sort of the spectacle of tools. And then the other is sort of what are the kind of cultural, financial, economic, contextual infrastructures that go into making
that are required. Yeah. So one thing I'll say off the bat is, one of the things I've been struggling with or thinking a lot about lately is the way in which, as artists, we're oftentimes like inventing tools that then get co-opted by industry, which is sort of part of something you said there that reminded me of that. And that, artists are oftentimes like the forerunners to the future, and yet we're oftentimes not compensated for the labor that goes into creating the tools. And so I think that's an issue. I would love to write a book on that someday. And I think with that being said, I think, so that kind of goes into like the spectacle piece also, because I think part of what I've been starting to see in this intersection between art, science, and technology is that artists are starting to use the tools that exist out there, and we're not inventing our tools as much. And I find this highly problematic or concerning. So if we go back to the 1990s, we had this like Precambrian explosion. We had like, Diane Gromala, Jeffrey Shaw, all these folks like in the, Banff new media space, and they were working with new tools in an applied media sense, where they're looking critically at those tools to create like a shadow discourse or something. And then also artists like inventing their own tools. But now my concern is that we're using pre-existing corporate tools like, Oculus and all of these things to make this immersive work. So I think that's one piece of what I would call like the spectacle, and like just using those tools. And I think we need to go back to becoming more subversive and making subversive tools. So there's that piece. In terms of the infrastructure piece, I think what's challenging is it's one of the things I always try to bake into budgets, and I'm never very successful at, is like, how do we get funding, not just for the work itself, but actually for the R&D, like for the experimental sandbox environment where we can play with and invent new tools. And that requires an even greater kind of infrastructure. So that's one thing I'm also kind of thinking through, which is why I've decided actually to go, into academia, because I feel like now I'm in this position, at this AI and Art Center. We got a lot of NVIDIA investment, and they want us to build out the center. So then there's tools that come with that. But then how do we share those tools with communities? Like, at RPI, I was always struck by the fact, and I think, Brenda and Kathy, I give them so much applause for like actually trying to be that bridge with community. So we have the fancy school on the hill, and then we have, the community in South Troy. And I think, the sanctuary is really this bridge builder. And I think if we could have that model in every city across the country, or, communities where there are schools, major schools with resources, that could help this infrastructure question around community. Because the projects, because they're using heavy technology, and also the science part, I'll get into that in a sec, different funding, there are not, everybody's competing for the same limited resources, creative capital, all of the creative tech things, right? But I think there are other ways to distribute those resources by really getting institutions to come on board to build community spaces with these technologies, so that we can, make those tools more available. Yeah, I hope that answered your question.
That was really great. Matthew, do you have any follow-up you want to ask for that, or is that good?
Oh gosh, no, it's just a hearty cosign. Yeah, thank you. Well said.
Thank you. Yeah, I really love. I love the way you're advocating for all of that, and I think that this is something that we really need too. So I appreciate that question very much, Matthew, and also your answer, Heidi. That was really, really wonderful. Sadly, we have run out of time. Anybody have any last gasps that they have to they're dying to ask Heidi before we jump off? Because if not, we will have to close up. Give you 1 minute. Yes, we will be putting this recording on the Media Sanctuary website. So it's mediasanctuary.org, where you did your registration. If you go back there and put in BioArt Talks, you will be able to locate it. We'll try to send it out to everybody who registered, so that you'll get the link, okay? And then pass it on. Oh, sorry, not that.
I don't know yet.
Max,
so we're in conversation with PBS right now to get some small R&D grant to develop out and see where it might land, and if they're in alignment with it. And then we're talking to lots of folks. We have a producing part board, but we're talking to different media outlets right now. So, but I will be sure to let Kathy know when we figure all of that out.
Great. Thank you. Thanks for that question, Max. Okay. I'm going to sign off, and thank you all for coming. Thank you so much, Heidi. This was really an incredibly delicious talk and time spent with you. Please come next week. We have a talk by Aysen Karo Chatsin, and it's BioArt and the assistive device art. Really wonderful artist. So that's next Friday, April 8th at the same time, same channel. Thank you all. I really appreciate you all being here. Have a good day.